They left the obese girl in the snow to die mountain. Man found her and refused to let heaven take her. Leave her, the guide said coldly. She's slowing us down. The wind howled through the Rockies that night, tearing at the wagons, whipping snow into the eyes of desperate travelers. In the pale light of a dying moon, Prudence Ashford lay asleep in the back of her wagon, unaware that her fate had already been decided. Her father, Cornelius Ashford, a proud Boston merchant, stood beside the fire, his jaw clenched. "If one must be sacrificed," he murmured, "better her than all of us." Jake Morrison, the rugged trail guide hired to lead them west, didn't hesitate. "Then it's done." When the storm reached its fiercest, they took the lantern, the food, the horses, and left her behind. The last sound she heard before waking was the crunch of wheels fading into the white void. When Prue opened her eyes, she saw nothing but endless snow. The fire was gone, the wagons gone, her father gone. Only silence and the cold pressed against her skin like a cruel hand. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. By midnight, she could no longer feel her fingers. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she stumbled forward, calling for help no one would give. Then her legs gave out. The snow welcomed her like a grave. "Maybe this is what I deserve," she whispered through chattering teeth. Maybe they were right. And as her eyes fluttered shut, a shadow moved in the storm, tall, broad, wrapped in furs. A man. He knelt beside her, felt the faint pulse beneath her frozen skin, and growled through the wind, "Not tonight. Heaven's not taking you yet." He lifted her into his arms and vanished into the blizzard. When Prue Ashford awoke again, she thought she had already died. The air was warm. A fire crackled somewhere close. She could smell pine smoke and leather, not the sterile perfume of her father's estate, but something raw and real. For a moment, she didn't dare open her eyes. The last thing she remembered was snow in her mouth and the sound of her own heart slowing down. Then she heard it, a man's voice, low and rough like gravel against wood. "Easy there, girl. You're safe now." Her eyelids fluttered open. A dim cabin came into view, walls of rough-cut logs sealed with moss. Animal pelts hung from beams, and a large man sat beside her bed, sharpening a knife by firelight. His shoulders looked carved from stone, his beard black with streaks of gray, his face shadowed and unreadable. Where am I?" Prue whispered, her lips cracked from the cold. "Rocky Ridge," he replied. "Found you half buried in the snow a few miles east. Name's Josiah Blackwood. Most folks call me Joe." She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain ran through her legs. Joe reached out, steady but careful, pressing her back against the furs. "You got frostbite bad. Took me near 3 hours to get the blood moving again. You move too soon, you'll lose your toes." Prue blinked, confusion and fear mixing inside her. "My family, the wagon train, they're gone," he said flatly, without cruelty. "Storm buried every trail they left behind. I only saw you." The truth hit her harder than the wind ever could. They hadn't been lost. They'd left her, her own father, the people who promised to protect her. She turned her face away, tears slipping down her cheeks. Joe didn't speak for a long while. He just tossed another log into the fire. The room glowed orange, lighting the scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw, a relic of some war he didn't have to name. "Eat," he said finally, handing her a tin cup filled with broth. "You'll need strength if you plan to keep breathing." Prue took it with trembling hands. The warmth spread through her chest like mercy. Why, why did you help me? She asked softly. You could have left me there. Joe shrugged, staring into the fire. Because I've seen enough folks die in the cold. Didn't want another on my conscience. There was something in his tone, not pity, but weariness. The voice of a man who'd seen too much loss and stopped expecting kindness in return. For days, Joe nursed her back to life. He spoke little, but every action was deliberate, changing her bandages, feeding the dogs, boiling herbs for her fever. Prue learned his silence wasn't coldness, it was grief, buried deep beneath years of solitude. And as the storm outside raged on, she began to realize that the man who had saved her wasn't just a recluse. He was a soul exiled by his own past, just as she had been exiled by her family's shame. One night, as Joe sat by the fire carving wood, Prue whispered, I thought my life ended out there. He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. Maybe it did, he said, but sometimes dying once is what it takes to start living. When the storm finally eased, the world outside Joe's cabin was buried under a glittering ocean of white. The mountains looked silent and holy. The trees bowed beneath the weight of snow. For Prue, it was both beautiful and cruel, a reminder of the night she was left to die, and of the man who had carried her back from the edge of death. Joe said little about what he planned to do with her. Each morning, he stepped outside to check the traps or cut firewood, his figure disappearing into the blue-gray light of dawn. When he returned, his coat was dusted with frost, his hands red and raw, yet he always set aside the first bowl of stew for her. Eat first, he would grumble, pretending it wasn't kindness. As her strength returned, so did her shame. She saw how his cabin was simple, but built with precision, every log fitted tight, every tool sharpened, everything earned by calloused hands. She had never worked for anything in her life. Her family's fortune had come from factories and servants. She had been taught to paint and speak French, not to split wood or mend a coat. And now here she was, clumsy, weak, alive only because a stranger refused to let her die. One morning, Prue asked him, When will you take me back to the town? He didn't look up from his work. Nearest town's a week away by sled, maybe more with this snow. You'd never make it in your state. I can try. Joe gave her a look that silenced her instantly, not angry, just firm. You die before sunset. You stay here until you can walk without shaking. For days they followed that uneasy rhythm. Joe hunted, Prue watched, Joe chopped. Prue stitched torn furs with trembling fingers. It wasn't until she offered to feed his sled dogs that he truly looked at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. They don't take kindly to strangers, he warned. They'll learn, she said quietly. He almost smiled, almost. As time passed, Prue's body healed. The frostbite faded to scars. Her strength slowly returned, and with it, her curiosity. She watched Joe move around the cabin with quiet efficiency, every motion deliberate, every breath measured. There was a calmness to him, but beneath it she sensed something darker, like a river running under ice. One evening, while Joe mended a snowshoe by the fire, she asked, You said you were a soldier. Was it the war? He paused, his hand stilling. Union Army, 15th Regiment. Survived the war. Lost everyone I cared about afterward. Guess I figured the mountains were quieter. I'm sorry, she whispered. He nodded once, not meeting her eyes. Don't be. Mountains don't judge. They just take or give, depending on how you treat 'em. That night, when the wind began to howl again, Joe built up the fire and spread an extra blanket over her without a word. Prue lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing across the room. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, she insisted on helping with chores. Joe protested, but she stood her ground. "If I stay here, I won't be a burden." So he taught her. He showed her how to chop wood, her hands blistered, but she didn't stop. He taught her how to melt snow for water, how to tell the difference between storm clouds and sunrise. When she stumbled, he steadied her. When she burned her fingers on the pot, he bandaged them, shaking his head but saying nothing. In return, she cleaned his cabin, mended his shirts, and even cooked once, though the bread came out hard as stone. Joe bit into it without complaint. "Tastes like effort," he said, and she laughed for the first time since Boston. It was a strange kind of journey, not across mountains, but across trust. Each day they moved a little closer to something unnamed. And though Joe still spoke little, his silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like peace. By midwinter, the blizzards had calmed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. The days were slow but full, the kind of days that left Prue's body aching and her heart strangely light. She had never known such quiet before, the kind that hums between the crackle of firewood and the soft breathing of the sled dogs outside the cabin door. Each morning began the same way. Joe rose before dawn, fed the dogs, then stoked the fire until the cabin glowed gold. He would leave to check his traps, sometimes gone for hours, and Prue would sit by the window, sewing or writing clumsy notes in a little leather journal she found on a shelf. When he returned, his coat heavy with snow, she would have stew warming on the hearth. "You don't have to do that," he said one day, setting down his rifle. "I know," she answered, smiling faintly, "but it makes me feel like I belong here." Joe looked at her for a moment too long, then busied himself with cleaning his weapon. "Belonging is a rare thing in these parts," he muttered. In the evenings, they would share quiet dinners, sometimes speaking, often not. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer cold. It was a place of understanding where words were unnecessary. When Joe spoke, it was about simple things: the tracks of a lynx near the creek, the snow melting faster on the southern slope, the way the moon hung low over the valley like a lantern. Prue listened, not for the facts, but for the way his voice softened when he spoke of the land. "You love it here," she said one night. Joe nodded. "The mountains don't care who you were, they only care who you are when the storm comes." It was then she realized he wasn't just hiding from the world, he was healing from it. In time, her hands grew stronger. She'd learned to split logs cleanly, to snare rabbits, to patch the roof when the snow began to melt. Joe watched her with quiet pride, though he rarely said it aloud. One afternoon, as she struggled to lift a bucket of water from the well, he stepped behind her and steadied her hands. His breath was warm against her ear. "Don't fight the weight," he murmured. "Work with it." For a moment she froze, not from fear, but from the strange electricity of being seen, truly seen, by someone who wasn't judging her body, but guiding it. She glanced up at him. His face was close, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Good. You'll manage that yourself soon." Prue's heart took longer to steady than her breath. That night, when she was brushing her hair by the fire, Joe spoke from his chair. "You've got spirit," he said quietly. "Your folks ever notice that?" She laughed bitterly. "They noticed everything about me except that." He watched her reflection in the firelight. "Then they're fools." The words sank deep, deeper than he knew. No man had ever called her strong before. No one had ever looked at her and seen more than her size. As winter dragged on, the outside world seemed to vanish entirely. The cabin became their universe, the walls holding in warmth, the roof creaking under snow, the wind howling like a distant memory. Joe built her a pair of fur-lined boots. She mended the rip in his coat. When one of the dogs fell ill, she sat up all night nursing it, and when it recovered, Joe smiled. For the first time, she could remember not a faint twitch, but a full, quiet smile that reached his eyes. "You did that," he said. "Didn't think anyone could." "Then maybe you don't know me yet," she teased softly. His gaze lingered a second too long before he turned back to the fire. "Maybe I'm starting to." There were no declarations, no grand gestures, just a growing ease between two souls who had been forgotten by the world and somehow found each other in its silence. One evening, as the snow melted into spring runoff, they stood outside watching the first patch of grass break through the frost. The sun was setting behind the ridge, washing the world in copper and gold. Prue shivered, not from cold, but from the memory of that night, months ago, the night she was left to die. Joe noticed, draped his fur coat around her shoulders, and said quietly, "You're safe now." She turned toward him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Am I?" He met her gaze, steady and certain. "As long as I'm breathing." Spring crept slowly into the Rockies. The snow melted into streams that sang through the valley, and the world seemed to breathe again. For a time, peace returned to the cabin. The dogs barked happily in the thawing yard, and the air carried the smell of pine and damp earth instead of ice. But peace in the wilderness never lasted long. Joe had noticed signs, footprints that weren't his. Branches snapped at the edge of the ridge, smoke far off in the trees. Someone was out there. He said nothing to Prue at first, not wanting to worry her. Yet each night he cleaned his rifle and checked the door locks twice. Prue, meanwhile, was changing in her own way. The quiet life had transformed her. She had grown stronger, surer of herself. Her laughter came easier, her steps steadier. But inside her still lived the shadow of fear, fear that the world might remember her, drag her back into its cruelty. One afternoon, Joe returned from the traps later than usual, his jaw tight. "Someone's been following the creek," he said. "Boot prints. 2 men, maybe 3. "Bandits?" He shook his head. "Could be, or worse, someone looking for you." Prue's stomach turned. "My family? Or the guide that left you? Morrison?" Joe's voice was flat, but his eyes burned with a quiet anger. "If he's alive, he knows what he did, and he wouldn't want you talking." The days that followed were tense. Joe set up watch at night, keeping the lantern low. Prue tried to act calm, but her hands trembled as she worked. Every creak of the cabin made her flinch. One evening, while Joe was repairing the sled harness outside, she sat by the fire staring at the only possession she had left from her old life, a silver locket. Inside was a small painted portrait of her mother and a folded letter sealed in wax. Joe stepped inside quietly. "What's that?" "My father gave it to me the day we left Boston," she said. "He told me it was a reminder of home. I never opened it before." She broke the seal with shaking hands and unfolded the parchment. The letter was short, too short. "Prudence, If you read this, know that what I do is necessary. Your marriage secures our name and our future. Forgive me for the cruelty the world demands of men." She stared at it until the words blurred. "He didn't even call me his daughter," she whispered. Joe watched her in silence, then knelt beside her. "You don't owe that man forgiveness. He threw away his own blood to save his pride." For a moment she wanted to argue to defend the family that had abandoned her, but she couldn't. The truth burned too deep. That night, as they sat by the fire, the wind carried a distant echo, the faint pop of a rifle. Joe's head snapped up. He moved to the window, peering into the darkness. "They're here," he muttered. "Who?" "Riders. 3 of 'em, maybe more. They've been circling all day." He turned back to her, voice low and steady. "If anything happens, you take the dogs and follow the ridge north till you find the river. Don't stop. Don't look back." "I'm not leaving you." "You will if I tell you to." Prue stood, her face pale, but her eyes unyielding. "You saved me once, Joe. I won't watch you die for me." The tension in the room broke like ice under weight. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "Stubborn woman," he murmured. "Maybe that's what I like about you." Outside, the dogs began to bark. The shadows of riders flickered between the trees, torches cutting through the dusk. And Prue understood. The past she had tried to outrun had found her at last. Joe loaded his rifle, his movements calm and deliberate. "Stay behind me," he said. "No one's taking you. Not now, not ever." The night fell heavy and still. Only the crackle of the fire and the low growl of the dogs broke the silence. Then came the first shout, rough, mocking voices echoing through the trees. "Blackwood!" one of them yelled. "We know you're in there. Step aside and hand over the girl. She belongs to the Ashfords." Joe's eyes hardened. He moved to the window and saw them clearly now. Jake Morrison and 2 armed men, their faces half hidden beneath scarves. The torchlight danced against the snow, painting the woods in orange fire. "Stay low," he whispered to Prue. "And if I tell you to run—" "I won't," she said quietly. He gave her a sharp look, but she didn't flinch. For a long heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Joe took his rifle and stepped to the door. When he opened it, the wind howled in biting cold against his skin, the smell of smoke and gun oil thick in the air. Jake grinned from the shadows. "Still playing the hero, Blackwood? She's not yours to keep. The family wants her back, and they're paying good money for it." "She's not property," Joe said evenly, "and she sure as hell ain't yours." Jake's grin faded. "You think you can take all of us?" "I don't need to," Joe said, leveling his rifle. "Just you." The shot split the night. Jake's hat flew off as the bullet grazed his head. Chaos erupted, gunfire cracking, dogs barking, snow flying up in violent bursts. Prue crawled to the corner, heart pounding, loading bullets the way Joe had taught her. "Joe!" she shouted, tossing him the rifle when his clip emptied. He caught it without looking, fired again, dropping one of the attackers to the ground. The second man rushed toward the door, but Joe met him halfway, slamming him back into the snow. The 2 grappled fists, elbows, a flash of steel. Prue grabbed the fallen pistol, her hands trembling, and aimed. The world narrowed to a single sound, her heartbeat, and she fired. The man fell. Silence followed. Jake, clutching his bleeding ear, stumbled backward, eyes wild with fear. "You'll regret this, woman," he spat. "You think that hermit can protect you forever?" Joe stepped forward, rifle steady. "She doesn't need me to protect her, not anymore." Jake hesitated, then turned and fled into the trees. For a long moment, only the sound of the wind remained. Then Joe lowered the rifle and turned to her. She stood in the doorway, breath ragged, smoke still curling from the barrel of the pistol. "You did good," he said quietly. "Real good." Prue looked at him, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. "I didn't want to kill him." "I know." Joe stepped closer, resting a rough hand on her shoulder. "But sometimes surviving means choosing to live." And as the torches faded into the dark, the cabin stood once again in silence, battered but unbroken. By morning, the snow had fallen again, covering every trace of blood and footprints outside the cabin. The world looked clean, as if the violence of the night before had never happened. But Prue and Joe knew better. They had fought for their lives and won. Joe buried the dead men in the frozen ground behind the ridge, silent except for the murmured prayer he hadn't said since the war. When he came back, his hands were numb, his breath white in the morning air. Prue met him at the door with a blanket and a steaming cup of coffee. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," she said softly. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time there was no wall between them. "I ain't alone," he said simply. In the days that followed, the townsfolk from Cedar Bluff rode up to investigate the gunfire. When they heard what had happened, when Prue told them who she was and what Jake Morrison had done, word spread fast. Within weeks, Jake was captured downriver and taken for trial. Justice, long overdue, was finally on its way. But Prue didn't return east. When her family's lawyer arrived to reclaim her, she stood straight, her voice clear and steady. "Tell my father I'm no one's burden anymore. Tell him I lived without his name, without his money, and without his mercy." That spring, when the mountain flowers bloomed, she and Joe were married in the little church at Cedar Bluff. No silks, no diamonds, only a ring forged from iron and love. That night, they stood together on the ridge above their cabin, watching the sun set over the valley. "They left me to die," she whispered. Joe slipped an arm around her, his voice low. "And I found you to live." Every scar tells a story, some of pain, some of survival, and some of love, born from both. Prudence Ashford was left to die in the snow, but she rose again, not through luck, but through the hands of a man who saw her worth when no one else did. If you've ever been told you're not enough, not thin enough, not strong enough, not perfect enough, remember this: love doesn't measure. It recognizes. Wherever you're watching from tonight, America, Vietnam, Germany, or beyond, tell me in the comments, do you still believe love can find us in the cold?